Welcome back. A non-profit organisation formed by passionate African entrepreneurs who saw the devastation being caused by malaria epidemic in Africa have collaborated with global partners and governments of Mozambique, South Africa and Eswatini through an initiative known as MOSASWA. Their aim is to eradicate malaria. It's estimated that about 3.2 billion people, almost half of the world's population, are at risk of malaria. To talk more about this, we're joined by Sherwin, co-founder and CEO of Goodbye Malaria. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Charles. Just looking at some stats, I see that the Africa region accounts for about 95% of global malaria cases and 96% of malaria deaths. But yes, we still say that malaria is curable and can be treated. What are we seemingly not getting right in terms of preventative measures?
Yeah, good evening. Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me on. As you correctly mentioned, Africa does account for the majority of the burden of disease of malaria. The challenge that we faced with, even as you mentioned, we know how to cure it, we know how to treat it, we know how to prevent malaria. The challenge is that on the continent, malaria is affecting the poorest of the poor. The terrain in which we need to implement the malaria programs is sometimes very difficult, and the implementation of malaria programs is not an easy task. And so it has become very difficult for us to win the war against malaria. And so we've seen a stagnation of progress in the last 3 years.
And that's precisely because of COVID. We saw that there was a lot of focusing of attention on dealing with COVID-19 and other diseases, therefore falling by the wayside. What was the impact, particularly for Southern Africa? Because I understand that because of COVID-19, we saw more malaria cases, more deaths.
Yes, we have noticed that. Of course, the pandemic, as a consequence of it, we saw resources being applied towards dealing with the pandemic. Unfortunately, our economies on the African continent is under pressure. It's going to take us a lot longer to recover from the impact of COVID. And that has a fundamental impact on the malaria programs, particularly in Southern Africa. We saw some of the programs stalling, but as you saw in today's announcement, there's new resources that are being put to the fight. The resources are being put across a regional basis, so covering South Africa, Eswatini and Mozambique. And we're very confident that we will get back on track. There's a new urgency in the fight against malaria. South Africa has committed to eliminating malaria within the next 5 years. So we're all excited to have the programs get back on track.
So just tell us a little bit about your involvement as CEO and co-founder of Goodbye Malaria and the third MOSASWA regional grant in Mozambique, the outcomes thereof.
So the MOSASWA, the regional grant, the MOSASWA grant is quite unique in its form. It's a partnership between the Global Fund, the three countries, namely South Africa, Eswatini and Mozambique, as well as the private sector. Goodbye Malaria and its partners, namely Nando's and Vodacom, have really been involved in malaria elimination in Southern Africa for the past 6 years. The third grant will be for the next 3 years, and we've seen significant progress in Southern Africa. As we all know, mosquitoes do not need a passport or appreciate the borders that exist between our countries. So having the three countries on the southern part of the continent collaborate with each other, they align their policies, they align their strategies, they align their strategic plans for malaria and work together as a team in malaria eradication. And this has helped us to assist Eswatini. They have less than 500 cases in the country, to assist South Africa, who only have a few thousand cases, most of which are imported, as well as assist southern Mozambique to get pretty close to subnational elimination.
And just how far off are we, or how well prepared are we to meeting the goals, the WHO 2030 Global Malaria Strategy goals?
Whilst we've stagnated, we're still on track. And I think that WHO had a meeting in Cape Town last week where we saw the South African malaria team actually win an award from WHO for the funding that has been put to malaria programs in South Africa and in this regional grant. We firmly believe that South Africa could, in the next 5 years, get to eliminating malaria. Of course, that means a doubling up of our effort, a new urgency in getting across the line, and ensuring the right resources are in place. We faced with a big challenge on the continent. Malaria, we've seen that there's resistance to the current medication that is being used in certain parts of Africa. We've seen that there's resistance on the insecticide side. So the mosquitoes, the normal insecticides, the mosquitoes are building up resistance to it. And so we need to deal with that with the newfound urgency. And so I think as the press release read, we're confident that in Southern Africa, we can eliminate malaria and meet those targets that the WHO have set.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us. Sherwin Charles is the co-founder and CEO of Goodbye Malaria.